The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire from 1532 to 1572 marked a profound transformation in the Americas as Francisco Pizarro and a small group of conquistadors overcame numerical odds to capture Inca Emperor Atahualpa during the Battle of Cajamarca. Leveraging superior military technology and forming alliances with subjugated tribes, the Spaniards secured a substantial ransom for Atahualpa's release, only to execute him later and push further into Inca territory. And the fall of Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire in 1533, significantly advanced Spanish control, though complete conquest took years due to pockets of resistance from Inca loyalists like Manca Inca and Tupac Amaru. The conquest dismantled one of the pre-Columbian America's largest empires and established Spanish colonial dominance, profoundly influencing the region's culture, language, and government. Allow me to welcome you to the channel. Today we're going to look at some more colonial history. Bit of an interesting one, if not a little bit sad at the same time. But we're going to talk about it from start to finish. As always, if you want to support the channel, just enjoy the content. You can also click the like and subscribe, that'll help me out. And if you want to go further to that, there's a few links in the description. But with that being said, let's all get nice and relaxed and we can begin for today. We start with the conflict between Atahualpa and Huáscar during the Civil War, which had had a detrimental impact on the empire just before its confrontation with the Spanish. Indeed, it's not the case that everything was all sunshine and lollipops before the colonial rulers came to take over. In fact, there was always war. There was always fighting. Now, historians are, however, uncertain about the potential outcome of a united Inca Empire's conflict with the Spanish in the long run, something that can't really be said for sure. And it is this uncertainty that arises from various factors, including the significant loss of life, mainly caused by diseases, which led to more than a little social upheaval, as well as the superior military technology possessed by the new conquistadors. Now, just to name a few of the advantages that the Spanish conquistadors had, we're talking dogs, horses, metal armor, swords and cannons, and they had firearms, albeit rudimentary ones. This is still quite early in the history of firearms, but they were still quite effective. Now, not as effective at mowing down dozens and dozens of people at a time, but a lot of the time, if you didn't know what it was, and you heard an extremely loud noise, louder than thunder, and all of a sudden the guy next to you has had his head exploded, well, that had a very deep effect on morale, confusion. A lot of the time during these colonial exploits, firing a warning shot was enough to scare people away, and that is indeed what they did quite a bit. Now, Atahualpa seemed to have greater popularity among the people compared to his brother, and he was undoubtedly more esteemed by the army, which was primarily stationed in the newly acquired northern province of Quito. Initially, each brother, that being Atahualpa and Huáscar, held power over their own territories. Atahualpa ruled over the northern region, while Huáscar governed the city of Cusco, which was the capital, and also the extensive southern territory, which included the vicinity, by the way, of Lake Titicaca. Now, this region in particular provided a substantial amount of soldiers for Huascar's forces, and following a period of diplomatic maneuver and strategic positioning, a state of open conflict had broken out. You see, Huascar appeared ready to swiftly and definitively finish the war, when his faithful warriors actually managed to capture Atahualpa, who was participating in a celebration in the city of Tumebamba. Nevertheless, Atahualpa promptly fled, and he managed to make his way back to Quito. When he got back, he managed to gather a minimum of 30,000 highly skilled soldiers. Although Huascar was able to gather a similar quantity of warriors, they possessed significantly less battle experience. Thus, from there, Atahualpa dispatched his troops to the south, led by his top generals. They achieved continuous strings of triumphs against Huascar, swiftly advancing to the outskirts of Cusco. These two generals, by the way, were Chalcochima and Quisquis. During the initial day of conflict for Cusco, the troops that remained faithful to Huascar secured an early upper hand, and things were looking pretty good. However, on the second day, Huascar himself led an imprudent and unexpected assault, which the generals Chalcochima and Quisquis were already very well aware was coming. Now, surprise attacks usually lose their effectiveness when everybody knows they're about to happen. Kind of defeats the purpose. And no one likes to ruin the surprise, don't they? Well, because of this failure, Huascar was apprehended during the subsequent conflict, leading to the total disintegration of the resistance. Soldiers demoralized and defeated, and the general strung up in chains. How to come back from that one? Thus, the triumphant commanders dispatched a message to Atahualpa, utilizing a Chasque messenger who had relocated from Quito to the luxurious hot springs near Cajamarca. The courier delivered news of the ultimate triumph on the very day that Pizarro and his limited group of explorers, accompanied by a few native supporters, descended from the Andes into the town of Cajamarca. So, the news of one victory being overshadowed by a very unpleasant thing to come. Now, Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, that being Gonzalo, Juan, and Hernando, were very enticed by the reports of a wealthy and extraordinary empire. Thus, they departed from the then destitute Extremadura, similar to several subsequent migrants. As Francisco Pizarro wrote in his diaries, "There lies Peru with its riches, here Panama and its poverty. Choose, each man, what best becomes a brave Castilian." Castile is in reference to the area of Spain, Castile. Now, in 1529, Pizarro was granted authorization by the Spanish monarchy to undertake the conquest of the territory which was known as Peru. Historian Raúl Porras Barrenechea asserts that the word Peru does not actually originate from Quechuan or Caribbean languages, but rather from Indo-European, or perhaps a combination of several linguistic influences. In any case, at the time, unbeknownst to Pizarro, while he was seeking approval for his journey, the group he intended to confront was already suffering severe damage from the illnesses introduced by previous Spanish interactions in the Americas. But of course, back then, they didn't really know much about germ theory. It was very hard to know exactly what was going to come, so this wasn't a deliberate thing. It wasn't like they were planning to show up and spread smallpox everywhere. It's just what happens when you encounter something that you haven't encountered before. This happens to people who go traveling for the first time and they drink some kind of fruit juice and you break out in all these little red dots all over your skin. And you have to go and get things like antihistamines and all the rest. So it's not to the extent of having 90% of your population wiped out by smallpox, but to a smaller extent, we do have these problems even in the modern day. That's why some places you have to get vaccines to go to, and so on. Now, upon Pizarro's arrival in Peru in 1532, he observed significant changes in the region compared to his visit just 5 years prior. In the midst of the wreckage of the city of Tumbes, he endeavored to comprehend the circumstances unfolding before him. He acquired knowledge of the civil conflict and the epidemic that was plaguing the Inca Empire from 2 indigenous youths which he had instructed in the Spanish language, of course for the sole purpose of serving as his translators. Pizarro successfully founded the initial Spanish colony in northern Peru, naming it San Miguel de Piura, following 4 arduous journeys. Well, upon the initial discovery by the indigenous people, Pizarro and his companions were actually mistaken for Viracocha Cunha, also known as deities. Thus the natives provided a description of Pizarro's warriors to the Inca. According to reports, Capito was described as being of large stature with a long beard and entirely covered in garments. The indigenous people provided a detailed account of the men's weaponry, specifically their swords, and explained how they used them to slaughter the sheep. The men abstained from consuming human flesh, and instead consumed sheep, lamb, duck, pigeons, and deer, which they prepared by cooking. Of course, this was a little bit different to what the Incas were used to, so it's an observation from their side. Now, Atahualpa had apprehension about the potential capabilities of the newly arrived Caucasian individuals, stranger danger of the highest order. Now, if they were ruthless conquerors, or indeed destroyers of nations, then Atahualpa thought it was prudent that he should simply escape. But if the individuals were in question, the Viracocha Cunha Luna Alichak, which translates to gods who are benefactors of the people, well, then instead of fleeing, obviously, he should stick around and give them a warm welcome. Well, after returning to Tangarala, the messengers were dispatched by Atahualpa to the Spanish, with Quinquinchara, a warrior from the Orion tribe, serving as a translator. Well, upon completing the journey with the Spanish, Quinquinchara reunited with Atahualpa to engage in discussion over the divine nature of the Spanish men. Quinquinchara concluded that they were men based on his observations of their eating, drinking, dressing, and engaging in sexual activities with women. Now he observed them not performing any miracles. Cinquejarra conveyed to Atahualpa that their forces were actually limited, consisting of between 170 to 180 individuals, and that they had actually restrained the native prisoners with metallic cords. Now, when Atahualpa inquired on how to handle the visitors, Cinquejarra recommended their execution, as he believed that they were actually malevolent bandits who would seize anything they desired, and actually referred to them as supaicuna, or devils. And that's a 1-star review from him. Well, he suggested confining them in their sleeping quarters and actually setting it on fire. That's one way to get rid of them. So, following the triumph of Atahualpa and the apprehension of his sibling Huascar, Atahualpa was actually abstaining from food at the Inca baths located outside of Cajamarca, and Pizarro and his forces arrived in the city on November 15th, 1532. Pizarro dispatched Hernando de Soto to the encampment of Atahualpa. De Soto traveled on horseback to visit Atahualpa, who had never encountered this unfamiliar animal before. Of course, horses are not native to that part of the world. Now, accompanied by a youthful interpreter, Soto delivered a pre-written oration to Atahualpa, confirming to him that they had arrived as emissaries of God, with the purpose of imparting the veracity of God's teachings. And he stated that he was conversing with them in order for them to, and I quote, lay the foundation of concord, brotherhood, and perpetual peace that should exist between us, so that you may receive us under your protection and hear the divine law from us, and all your people may learn and receive it, for it will be the greatest honor, advantage, and salvation to them all. Furthermore, they extended an invitation to the Inca leader to pay a visit to Pizarro himself at his residence located in the vicinity of the Cajamarca Square. Upon observing Atahualpa's fascination with his horse, De Soto proceeded to showcase his exceptional equestrian skills in close proximity. Atahualpa was quite impressed with this, and to show his kindness, he offered them a few drinks and gifts. Well, Atahualpa's response was prompted only by the arrival of Hernando Pizarro, the brother of Francisco Pizarro. He responded with the information that he had received from his scouts, stating that the Spanish had been engaging in intensive acts of murdering and enslavement of numerous individuals and residents who were along the shores. But Pizarro refuted the report, and Atahualpa, with scant facts and really no proof either way, dropped the issue, albeit quite grudgingly. Well, the next meeting, the men reached a consensus to convene the next day at Cajamarca. On the morning of November 16th, 1532, Pizarro strategically positioned his forces in an ambush around the Cajamarca Plaza, the destined meeting place. Currently, Pizarro commanded a total of 168 soldiers, that being 106 infantry and 62 cavalry. Upon the arrival of Atahualpa, accompanied by approximately 6,000 followers, who by the way were not armed. The friar Vicente del Valverde and the translator Felipillo encountered them and began to present the teachings of the authentic religion, as they called it, the requerimiento, and request also that his tribute as a subordinate of King Charles. Unfortunately, the translator was not as good as they thought he was. He was doing his best, though, but there were still some issues in communication. The friar presented the Bible to Atahualpa as the definitive source supporting his recent statement, but Atahualpa was not impressed, and he reportedly declared that he refused to be subordinate to any man. And, well, you can't really blame him. He's the king, after all. Well, I suppose the emperor, if we're talking about the Inca Empire. So why exactly would he be subordinate to anyone or anything? Well, that was his logic. Well, the Spanish did not like that answer. Pizarro incited an assault, which initiated the Battle of Cajamarca. The conflict commenced with the discharge of a cannon and the war cry, Santiago. The Spaniards discharged a series of gunshots at the defenseless group of Incas and advanced in a coordinated manner. Pizarro employed devastating cavalry attacks against the Inca army, which greatly surprised them and confused them when accompanied with all of the noisy and devastating gunfire. Nevertheless, a significant number of firearms employed by the Spanish proved challenging to wield effectively in close-quarters engagements. Either way, the impact was catastrophic. The astonished Incas put up such a weak opposition that the conflict has frequently been described as a massacre, resulting in the death of 2,000 Incas, and only one Spanish soldier being injured. Well, while there are differing historical reports regarding the events, it appears that the primary Spanish motives for the raid were a desire for plunder and clearly a lack of patience. The Inca probably didn't fully comprehend the conquistadors' requirements. Remember how I said that translator was a little, well, untrained. Well, Pizarro was very aware of the significant numerical disadvantage of his forces, but he did recognize that seizing the emperor and keeping him as a hostage would certainly provide him with a crucial advantage. You see, the majority of Atahualpa's forces were in the Cusco region, along with Quisquis and Chalcuchima, excuse me, the two generals that he trusted the most, and they were battle-hardened as well. They'd certainly seen their taste of battle in that civil war. Of course, this posed a significant drawback for the Inca. Their downfall was partly caused by a lack of self-assurance and a need to publicly display bravery and a commanding presence. The primary perspective is that the Inca civilization was ultimately overcome as a result of their inferior weaponry, utilization of open battle strategy, susceptibility to diseases, internal turmoil, the audacious tactics employed by the Spanish, and, of course, the capture of the Inca emperor. Of course, the Spanish had a shield of metal all over them. The Spanish armor proved to be quite efficient, at least against the majority of the Andean weaponry, although it was not completely impervious to maces, clubs, or slings. Subsequently, the majority of the indigenous people adopted a more guerrilla-style approach, selectively targeting the legs of the conquistadors in instances where they were not wearing armor. Nevertheless, subsequent conflicts such as the Mixton Rebellion, the Chichimeca War, and the Arauco War necessitated the conquistadors to form alliances with indigenous tribes during these later expeditions. Like we mentioned at the start, pockets of resistance. Now in February of 1533, Almagro arrived in Cajamarca and joined with Pizarro, bringing along 150 more men and 50 more horses. Following the Spanish conquest of Atahualpa during the massacre of Cajamarca, his wife was permitted to accompany him, and the Spanish troops instructed him in the game of chess, which he apparently quite enjoyed. Got to do something to fill the time in prison. While Atahualpa was held captive, the Spanish, despite being vastly outnumbered, coerced him into commanding his generals to retreat by menacing to execute him if he refused. Checkmate. Well, as per request of the Spanish envoy, Atahualpa proposed to fill a spacious chamber with gold and pledged to provide twice that quantity in silver. Although Pizarro seemed to agree with this proposal and permitted the accumulation of money, he actually had no intention of setting the Inca free. Now, in order to preserve peace, he relied on Atahualpa's sway over his generals and the populace. The transportation of the riches from Cuzco commenced on the 20th of December, 1532, and continued without interruption thereafter. On the 3rd of May, 1533, Pizarro obtained all of the riches he had asked for, which was then melted, purified, and transformed into bars. In January of 1533, Hernando Pizarro embarked on a mission to collect precious metals from the temples in Pachacamac. Upon his return in March, he successfully seized Chalcuchimac in the Juaja Valley. Pizarro dispatched a comparable mission to Cuzco, that's Francisco Pizarro, which resulted in the retrieval of several gold plates from the Temple of the Sun. Now, there was an issue that arose regarding the fate of Atahualpa. While Pizarro and Soto allegedly opposed his execution, the rest of the Spanish vehemently insisted on it. The Spaniards then became worried due to the false interpretations offered by the interpreter Felipilo. They were also informed that Atahualpa had commanded covert assaults, and his soldiers were concealed in the vicinity. Soto embarked on a reconnaissance mission with a limited number of troops to search for the concealed army, while the trial of Atahualpa took place in his absence. The charges included polygamy, incestuous marriage, and idolatry, practices that are, of course, disapproved of in Catholicism. But, well, they were pretty prevalent in Inca culture and religion. Well, the individuals who opposed the conviction and assassination of Atahualpa contended that he should be subjected to judgment by King Charles, as he held the position of sovereign prince. Atahualpa was compelled to undergo baptism to prevent being executed by burning, and with the aspiration of eventually reuniting with his family and eliminating the Spanish throughout the ceremony, they addressed him as Francisco. Well, it all didn't work out for poor old Atahualpa. He was executed by the Spanish captives on the 29th of August 1533 by method of garroting, which is not a gentle way to go. He was then interred with Christian rituals in the chapel of San Francisco at Cajamarca, but was promptly exhumed. The deceased's body was retrieved, most likely as per his previous wish, and transported to his ultimate resting location in Quito. Well, eventually, De Soto got back, and he was not impressed. In fact, he had discovered no substantiation nor even a hint of any clandestine assembly of Atahualpa's men. Pizarro proceeded with his contingent of 500 Spanish soldiers towards Cuzco, escorted by Chalcuchimac. The latter was executed by burning in the Juaja Valley on charges of clandestine correspondence with Quizquiz and orchestrating acts of defiance. Manco Inca Yupanqui allied with Pizarro following the demise of Tupac. Pizarro's expedition penetrated the core of the Tawantinsuyu on November the 15th, 1533. Now, Benalcazar, who was a lieutenant under Pizarro, and from the same region, by the way, of Extremadura, had already left San Miguel with a force of 140 infantry and a small number of horses for his expedition to conquer Ecuador. Oh, by the way, Ecuador is named because it's on the equator. Just a bit of trivia for you there. Now, in the vicinity of Riobamba, Ecuador, at the base of Mount Chimborazo, the conquering Spaniards encountered and triumphed over the formidable Inca warrior Rumiñahui, thanks to the assistance of Cañari tribesmen who acted as guides and even close friends. Rumiñahui retreated to Quito, and during his pursuit of the Inca army, Benalcazar was reinforced by a contingent of 500 soldiers under the command of the Guatemalan governor Pedro de Alvarado. Driven by a strong desire for wealth, Alvarado embarked on a journey towards the southern region without the official permission of the crown. He arrived on the coast of Ecuador and proceeded to travel inland towards the Sierra. Upon discovering that Quito was devoid of its inhabitants' valuables, Alvarado promptly joined and united the Spanish army. Alvarado consented to sell his fleet of 12 ships, his military personnel, along with weapons and munitions, and subsequently returned to Guatemala. Well, following the assassination of Atahualpa, Pizarro appointed Tupac, Atahualpa's brother, as a figurehead Inca monarch. However, Tupac passed away unexpectedly, resulting in Manco Inca Yupanqui assuming power. Initially, he assumed power as a supporter of the Spanish and commanded admiration in the southern territories of the empire. However, there was significant turmoil in the northern region close to Quito, where Atahualpa's military leaders were gathering soldiers. The assassination of Atahualpa resulted in the absence of any remaining hostage to dissuade the northern soldiers from launching an assault against the invaders. Under the leadership of Atahualpa's generals, Rumiñahui, Zope Zubahua, and Quizquiz, the indigenous troops were ultimately vanquished, so bringing an end to all coordinated uprisings in the northern region of the empire. Manco Inca initially maintained amicable relationship with Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish conquistadors, but nevertheless in 1535 he was entrusted to the care of Pizarro's brothers, Juan and Gonzalo, in Cuzco. Unfortunately, they subjected him to such severe mistreatment that he eventually revolted. Can't really blame him. He managed to depart Cuzco by using the excuse of retrieving a statue made entirely of gold from the adjacent Yucca Valley. One can only imagine. Hey, can you let me go? I just have to pick up this giant gold statue and I'll bring it back to you. Just let me leave and don't follow me. How could they fall for that? Well, Manco Inca sought to exploit the discord between Almagro and Pizarro in order to regain control of Cuzco. Commencing his efforts in April of 1536. Now, the siege of Cuzco persisted until the subsequent spring, and over that period, Manco's army successfully annihilated 4 reinforcement columns that were dispatched from Lima. However, they finally failed to achieve their objective of expelling the Spaniards from the city completely. The Inca leadership, you see, lacked the complete backing of all of their subjugated populations. What's that saying about a house divided? Well, additionally, the deteriorating morale among the Inca, along with the more advanced Spanish siege weapons, prompted Manco Inca to recognize that his aspiration to recapture Cuzco was becoming increasingly futile. Thus, he ultimately made the decision to retreat back to Tambo. Now, we actually do have some archaeological evidence which confirms the occurrence of the uprising incident, and it demonstrates that the Spanish conquistadors did receive assistance from the indigenous allies. In fact, as early as 2007, the bones of approximately 70 individuals, including men, women, and teenagers, were discovered in the line of a proposed freeway near Lima. Forensic evidence indicates that European firearms were responsible for the deaths of several natives, and this was most likely during the 1536 revolt. However, the majority of the natives were murdered by weapons that were locally made and used by the indigenous population. Following the Spanish reoccupation of Cuzco, Manco Inca and his forces withdrew to the stronghold of Ollantaytambo. There, he skillfully led several assaults against Pizarro's forces stationed in Cuzco, and even achieved victory over the Spanish occupiers in a direct confrontation. But upon realizing that defeat was really inevitable, Manco Inca strategically withdrew to the rugged terrain of Vilcabamba and founded the new Neo-Inca state. It was here that he and his successors maintained a degree of authority for several decades. Tupac Amaru, the final ruler of the Inca Empire, met his demise at the hands of the Spanish in 1572. The conquest was completed over a span of around 40 years. Several Inca endeavors to reclaim their empire had taken place, although none had achieved success. Therefore, the Spanish invasion was successfully accomplished, with the assistance of elements such as the smallpox epidemic and a significant communication and cultural barrier. Well, it makes you wonder if their translator had been a little bit more competent, if they might have just talked it out like men. I don't know. Maybe. I'm not saying it's completely his fault for not studying hard enough and not brushing up on his Inca language. But, well, it really makes you think sometimes with the alternate history and all that sort of thing. It's interesting. Well, either way, the Spanish had decimated a significant portion of the Inca civilization and enforced their own cultural practices upon the indigenous inhabitants. But the battle wasn't over. In fact, with nobody left to fight, the Spanish could only fight each other. A protracted power battle ensued between Francisco Pizarro and Diego del Almagro, culminating in a civil war that ultimately led to the demise of Almagro. In 1541, Almagro's faithful supporters and his offspring sought revenge for his death by assassinating Pizarro. The assassination took place in Pizarro's palace, when a group of assassins, many of whom were actually former soldiers of Diego del Almagro, engaged in a deadly battle. These individuals had been deprived of their rank and possessions following the demise of Almagro, so they really had nothing left to lose. Well, in spite of the conflict, the Spaniards did not disregard the process of colonization. The establishment of an audiencia real, which is a kind of a form of a high court, solidified the Spanish royal control over these areas. And Lima was formally established in January of 1535 as the foundation for the subsequent establishment of political and administrative institutions. In 1542, the Spanish established the Viceroyalty of New Castile, which was later renamed the Viceroyalty of Peru. However, the establishment of the Viceroyalty of Peru did not occur until the arrival of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo in 1569. Toledo terminated the indigenous Neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba by carrying out the execution of the Inca Tupac Amaru. He relocated the native population into Spanish-style communities, a process known as reductions, facilitated economic growth through the establishment of commercial monopolies, and enhanced the output of the Potosi silver mines by using the Inca practice of compulsory labor. That's one way to put it. Compulsory labor. Well, the assimilation of Spanish culture into Peru was accomplished not only by Pizarro and his fellow commanders, but also by the numerous Spanish individuals who arrived in Peru with the intention of exploiting its wealth and settling on the territory. These encompassed a diverse array of immigrants, including Spanish merchants, peasants, artisans, and Spanish women. The Spanish introduced African slaves to work alongside captured Incas in labor-intensive activities, such as agriculture and silver mining. Each of these individuals brought their own distinct elements of culture to incorporate into Peruvian civilization. Now, the entrance of the Spanish, of course, had devastating long-term consequences on the inhabitants of South America. Although all native groups were affected by European invasions during this era, the Inca population saw an extremely severe and swift drop pretty much immediately after contact. The population of the Inca Empire had a significant decrease from around 10 to 12 million in 1520 to less than 3 million in 1570. Furthermore, the population continued to decline after 1570, and it never really stabilized. The primary factor responsible for the drastic reduction in the indigenous population was the introduction of deadly diseases from the Old World, transmitted by colonizers and conquerors. Now, due to their lack of prior exposure, the indigenous population had developed basically no resistance and had significantly elevated mortality rates. Their immune system basically had no idea how to fight these diseases. A great number of individuals perished as a result of illnesses compared to any military force or armed confrontation. Due to the Incas' much weaker writing legacy compared to the Aztecs or the Maya, historians face a lot of challenges in accurately assessing population reduction or post-conquest events. However, there is a debate among researchers about whether the Inca contracted these ailments before the arrival of the Spanish. Now that's a plot twist. Some claim that the disease may have been introduced to the Inca Empire by traders and travelers prior to the Spanish presence. Now, either way, the epidemic, believed to be hemorrhagic smallpox, which sounds as bad as it is, arrived in the Andes around 1524. Although specific figures are not provided, Spanish records show that the population was severely decimated by disease, rendering them significantly weakened in their ability to oppose the foreign armies. But it seems a little bit convenient with the timing, don't you think? That being said, plagues and illnesses like this always pop up every now and then. You can't really stop them. But certainly quite convenient to line up so well. Either way, historians hold diverging views regarding the nature of the illness that occurred in the 1520s. A minority of experts argue that the epidemic was caused by a native disease known as carrion's disease, while others believe that it was indeed smallpox. According to a study conducted in 1981, it was found that the Andes saw 3 distinct decreases in population throughout the period of colonization. The initial mortality rate ranged from 30 to 50% during the initial smallpox pandemic. And that's a flip of a coin, isn't it? During the occurrence of a measles outbreak, there was an additional decrease of 25 to 30%. During the period from 1585 to 91, when there were simultaneous outbreaks of smallpox and measles, there was a significant decrease of 30 to 60%. Altogether, the decreases add up to a 93% fall from the population that existed before contact in the Andes region. Of course, the mortality rate among youngsters was notably elevated, guaranteeing that the consequences of the epidemic would persist into the subsequent generation. But in addition to the widespread sickness that had devastated the local inhabitants, they also endured significant enslavement, pillaging, and destruction as a result of battle. The Spanish forcibly appropriated numerous women from the indigenous population to use as domestic workers and sexual partners. During their conquest of South America, Pizarro and his troops looted and subjugated a large number of individuals. Certain indigenous communities freely submitted to vassalage in order to overcome the Inca Empire. The Huanca, Cañari, Chanca, and Chachapoya indigenous clans joined forces with the Spanish in their resistance against Inca domination. The fundamental approach of the Spanish towards local communities was that choosing to become vassals voluntarily would ensure safety and peaceful cohabitation, whereas persisting in opposition, well, that would lead to further casualties and devastation. They only really gave them one choice. And of course, the decimation of Christianity had a notable impact on the population of South America too. As Pizarro and the Spanish conquered the continent and established their dominance, they compelled numerous individuals to convert to Christianity. And by compelled, you know what I mean. Of course, asserting that they had instructed them in the principles of the sole authentic faith. Following the decline in local inhabitants and the surrender of the Inca Empire, the Spanish missionaries were basically free to carry out their work without any obstacles following the colonization. And in a single generation, the entire continent succumbed to Christian influence. Well, maybe not those people out in the middle of the Amazon. And finally, the presence of the Spanish had an unforeseen influence on the physical terrain. Recent research actually indicates that the Spanish invasion had this great impact on the coastline of Peru. You see, prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, the people living in the dry northern coast of Peru covered large sandy ridges with fortuitous types of protections, millions of discarded mollusk shells. Now this protective layer shielded the ridges from erosion for approximately 4,700 years before the Spanish even arrived, resulting in a vast, undulating landscape that can be seen actually from outer space. However, the incidental protection of the landscape was abruptly terminated when diseases introduced by the Spanish colonists significantly reduced the local population. Additionally, colonial authorities relocated the remaining survivors inland, without any human intervention to maintain the protective covering. The recently formed beach ridges eroded and disappeared. Archaeologist Torben Rick explains that although certain areas of the northern coast of Peru may actually appear untouched and very natural, if you take a closer look, you'll find that ancient civilizations deliberately manipulated the landscape by constructing beach ridge systems. Maybe it's time that you do go take a look. It's a beautiful place. I've not been myself, but I've heard wonderful things about Peru. Every time I do a video like this, I'm reminded of places I've not been yet. I suppose there's still plenty of time for that. Now, as we wind up the video, I'd like to thank you for watching so far. And I'm going to thank my top-tier supporters and patrons: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, and Wendy. Thank you very much, everyone. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Lots of love to you all.